Fatuma and I are going to talk about how you might, as an educator, create safe zones for our minority, immigrant, and refugee students this year. And this is in a particularly challenging year in ways that are going to affect minority, immigrant, and refugee students. So we're going to spend a little bit of time setting up those issues and sharing a little bit of detail. We'll echo a little bit about what Denzel and Adam have already said. Our first goal will be to center minority and immigrant voices, and I have the pleasure of presenting with Ms. Fatuma, and she's going to share some of her experiences. We will also discuss cumulative impacts of the recent events on these communities. This will include changes in immigration policy. We'll talk about the nationwide movement in response to the ongoing loss of Black lives, to police brutality, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll wrap that up by sharing methods and strategies to create safe zones in educational settings.
Hi, everyone. I'll jump right in after Candace. My name is Fatuma. The immigration status with the current administration has changed drastically. How has the immigration changes with the current administration affected refugee and immigrants in Maine? First of all, many refugees and immigrants in Maine are second settlers. That means they moved from different states across the country. That makes that many of them, there's fewer number of settlers that originally get admitted from the US borders to Maine. And also recently there have been many asylum seekers in Maine coming from various parts of Africa, including the Republic of Congo and Angola. And also usually the United States settles nearly 70,000 refugees in the United States. However, with the current administration, those numbers have declined drastically in that only 18,000 have been approved entry, and less than half of that have admitted to the United States. Black Lives Matter, when many people hear this, everybody's on guard. However, living in a predominantly white community in Maine, we often hear many stories of racism, such as people being called the N-word or to go back home. Recently, I have experienced being called the N-word while I left work and I had my children in the car. We were heading home. I had the windows rolled so they could enjoy the weather, and all of a sudden on incoming traffic, the driver yelled the N-word. I have an older 7-year-old that noticed it, and she said, "Mommy, why are they yelling at us?" And I was very terrified at that moment because this was my first time ever. And then I downplayed with my daughter and I said, they were not talking to us, and we just went out ourselves and we went home. However, that didn't sit right with me when I got home, and I needed to address with my daughter because down the road she will face the same situation I've faced that day. And I had to explain to a 7-year-old, which I shouldn't have had to, about why some people will call out people of color, of minorities, the N-word, or to go back home. And she got teary, but however, I feel like she got great information from me that that's how life sometimes is. Like, it might not always go the way it is. The other thing that many people, many immigrants and refugees face is being told to go back home. However, there are a lot of younger generations in here, especially in the city of Lewiston. Those younger generations, including teenagers, were born in Maine. And many of them, they have to hear being told to go back home, which is surprisingly very sad because all of this generation, especially the younger generation, this is where home is. So those are like some of the experiences of racism that we face in Maine. Another issue that refugees and minorities and immigrants have been facing is the racial disparities when related to COVID-19. Minorities, refugees, and immigrants' life experiences in Maine have been different compared to Maine society. However, the challenge families are facing during the pandemic is one that is in dire situation. Families have been affected very drastically by COVID-19 in different stages, and this includes like 1 in every 27 Black resident has tested positive for COVID-19 in Maine. However, according to the Press Herald and Maine Public Radio, Blacks and African Americans account for less than 2% of the general population. And the number that is coming up right now is more than 20% of those are tested positive for COVID-19. The numbers do not match. It doesn't make sense. I feel like something needs to be corrected in our leadership positions and also within our communities to set the records straight. Another thing that needs to be also taken into account is many refugees and minority families and immigrants do live in a very large family household, including extended families with grandparents and children. Therefore, it makes it even harder for them to try to contain this virus and also to be doing social distancing. So what are we doing? Maine Immigrant and Refugee Services partnered with a lot of local Maine communities to educate in a task force to educate communities the risks of COVID-19 and providing the necessary essential information that families do need, including sanitary items, providing masks, educating them in their own native language, and also providing them videos on ways through social media platforms such as WhatsApp and a way for them to get educated and learn and be more preventative.
I'm going to go ahead and expand on some of what Fatuma has mentioned here. I'd like to share a little bit, and again, this is kind of reiterating some of what you've heard already, but to discuss the factors that influence the health and well-being of migrants. And so this kind of sets the stage for what minority, immigrant, and refugee experiences, might be built on. And these include multiple instances of adversity at different phases of their migration. These can include the pre-migration phase where they could be exposed to war-affected areas, conflict, and human rights violations. They may face challenges with the linguistic and cultural similarity of their home nation or area. When they are moving, they are at risk for being exploited or violated on the way. The travel itself can be quite difficult, lacking in basic necessities. And then, of course, upon arrival, there are the issues associated with learning about the local culture, the local language. There's questions of statehood and whether or not they have, whether or not they will be granted asylum or immigration status. And there might be challenges in getting accustomed to the local cultural values as well. So across all of these phases, there is potential for traumatization and re-traumatization. And then on top of that, upon arriving, the current climate has added additional challenges. And so I'd like to walk through those and echo some of what Ms. Fatuma was saying. We will start with the current administration. In particular, and just to point out that this isn't intended to say one way or another, what opinion you should have about immigration policy. Rather, the point of this is to illustrate that the broader immigration policy has an impact on our minority, immigrant, and refugee communities. So just to highlight some of those policy changes that have occurred in the current administration, it includes cutting legal immigration and making that more challenging, slowing that process, requiring interviews for all visa applicants. There has been a reduction in refugee admissions, as well as a reduction in the number of asylum seekers who are admitted. The current administration has eliminated temporary protected status for 98% of those protected, and that particular status is associated with being protected from having to return to a country facing something like a natural disaster or internal or international conflict. And so, 98% of the people with that status have lost that status. There's zero tolerance policy for the US-Mexico border led to the family separations and detention that was widely publicized. As Denzel mentioned, the current administration is working to end deferred action for childhood arrivals, There is building the wall along our southernmost border to keep out people who are characterized as rapists and criminals. And then, of course, there's the Muslim ban, which has taken multiple forms at this point, but ultimately was successful in preventing travel from Muslim majority countries, including Somalia. And so whether or not you agree with these policies, there are definitely effects on immigrant communities. These include bullying, discrimination, segregation, povertization. To give an example, we know that, data have shown that anti-Islamic tweets from President Trump are associated also with additional anti-immigrant activity and anti-Muslim hate crimes. We also see fear and mistrust in our government and in institutional settings. That means that immigrants, minorities, and refugees are less likely to engage with our institutions, including, for example, reporting crime, including domestic violence. They also face poor mental health here, including things like anxiety and depression. So in addition, our communities have faced challenges trying to make sense of police brutality. And I say this as someone who has worked extensively with law enforcement in my past work with anti-trafficking, human trafficking. So, I've worked extensively with law enforcement, and I respect tremendously the work they do. And at the same time, there are clear instances of abuse of power and brutality, which recent data are showing clearly that are disproportionately affecting minorities, and in particular, Black minorities. So, this affects the communities as well. Again, there's that lack of community trust, lack of trust that they will be treated fairly. They anticipate and perceive that they will experience more frequent and harsher punishment. Again, fearing deportation, whether they are legal or illegal immigrants, leads them to have lower confidence in our criminal justice system, and also is associated with race-based trauma. Race-based trauma is associated with depression, anger, and hypervigilance. So, so again, this is all building together on top of the migration experience, and then we also had the COVID pandemic. And of course, our minority, immigrant, and refugee communities are at higher risk of experiencing COVID or becoming infected with COVID-19, but also at higher risk of having more severe cases. So our minority, immigrant, and refugee communities work in lower wage jobs that are among those that are higher risk of exposure. They are less likely to have paid leave. They are less likely to have health insurance. They have higher rates of poverty and insecurity and housing instability, which is further exacerbated by recent policy implementation by Homeland Security, who again, I have worked with in my past. As of February 2020, Homeland Security has implemented policy enabling them to deport even legal immigrants if they use any public benefits. So if legal immigrants use, for example, Medicaid because of a possible or actual COVID infection, they face the risk of arrest and deportation. And this is a nationwide issue as far as the health disparities. Fatuma focused on Maine, and nationwide, what we see is that minorities are experiencing greater deaths and cases. In particular, this is showing, this diagram from NPR is showing that nationwide Black Americans are experiencing higher rates of COVID as well as deaths relative to their proportion in the population. So what do we do? This is all, like when you imagine all of that coming together, this all becomes a little overwhelming. So what can we do to help? We wanted to end with some guidance in that respect. The first thing is to check in with yourself first, because I think most of us are feeling a little ragged around the edges, coming off the tail of in theory the tail, not really the tail of the pandemic, and social distancing and all of that. I think that emotionally we're all feeling a little bit barren. So it's really important that you check in with yourself and engage in regular self-care. And Fatuma and I sent out an assignment for you to take a look at the different areas of your life and assess where certain areas might be a little bit out of balance. And that's something that you can do on a regular basis to kind of check in what areas you might want to invest in. We also want to give you some guidance on how you might create and support safe zones in your educational institutions. Number one is to prepare the institution itself or your school itself. As you probably are well aware, minority immigrants and refugees have lower access to broadband internet, so they face greater achievement gaps that will likely need to be addressed this year. So perhaps preparing for that by making sure you have tutors who speak languages needed to support those students. Requiring implicit and racial bias training. I believe you all may have gotten the opportunity to do some implicit bias testing for yourselves, maybe doing that more widely and discussing it. Requiring de-escalation tactics for public safety officers, making sure that you are reviewing your school symbols and removing any associated with racism. Of course, investing in your pipeline to recruit, hire, and retain Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And as well demonstrate how diversity and inclusion is a priority at every level of your school or institution. There's also ways to prepare safe zones in your curricula and in your classroom. Again, this is not an overnight, this is not going to be solved overnight. This is an ongoing transformation of the educational environment. And I really think it's worth bearing in mind that this is, again, a marathon, not a sprint. So investing the time to understand the history of race and racism in the United States, doing that work yourself, and reviewing your discipline, your curriculum, the content of your classes, assignments, and your teaching style to evaluate whose experiences are centered, as well as how they could be more inclusive. And then, of course, taking responsibility for your own development, but ask for help when you need it. And I'll turn it over to Fatuma to talk about how we might activate those safe zones in our schools.
Thank you, Dr. Black. I think just like Dr. Black stated, creating safe zones for students when they return to your classroom is very, very important. Helping your students navigate the system in a way so they can feel comfortable when they approach you to talk, and also having them feel welcomed and appreciated that they're there in a diverse group, and also creating different opportunities for kids to process what the experiences they have dealt with, as well as creating groups that will help them be more positive in connecting with other students and peers. You don't have to be expert in the current situation or events that are going on, but it is very important to address them. And so that way students feel like there's current history that's happening is not being left out and brushed aside. And also focusing on listening to them, and also so that way they know what they're going through is heard of and that their voices are heard, as well as having students write their thoughts and comments about what they think of what's going on, whether it is in classroom or outside of classroom, is very, very relevant and very important, as well as being mindful of the practices of how you demand to have the knowledge of what's going on from immigrants and refugees and Black. Thank you.
So Fatuma and I found this activity from tolerance.org to give you an opportunity to figure out some strategies to maybe intervene when you see perhaps racism in your environment, whether it be from the students in your environment or from your colleagues. I saw someone in the chat previously suggest a particular three-phase, I think it was a three-phase intervention strategy. This is another one. The 4 steps in this particular case are interrupt, question, educate, and echo. And so we wanted to give the example of, if you hear somebody making a comment about the Chinese virus or something else that is attacking Asian Americans or Asian immigrants, then one of the key things to do is immediately stop the conversation or your activity to interrupt that train of that train of the conversation. So saying specifically, hold up, I want to talk about what you just said specifically, or I don't like words like that, or saying that that phrase is hurtful. Then questioning the individual, because part of the goal is not just to shut down that behavior, but to support long-term change in it. And so this and the next steps, I think, are really valuable for providing some of that feedback that would support that long-term change. So questioning what is it that makes you think that way, or why did you say that, or what do you mean, or tell me more about why you think that. And then that opens up that conversation to then provide education, to talk about the history or the context, or maybe some facts or statistics that you can discuss. I found myself in this role before, and I find that this particular approach is really effective in getting people to kind of be open to your position. And then at the last step being, echoing that if you are bearing witness to something like this, if you are witnessing a colleague taking these steps, that you are not silent, that you are echoing what the person interrupting is saying, that you thank them for speaking up and saying you agree. And that way, you know, you're bringing up this broader culture of not accepting racist beliefs, thoughts, or behavior, while also providing an alternative education for for those who are making those mistakes at that time. And last of all, we wanted to share some resources for you to go ahead and explore race, bias, and anti-racist activity. And of course, I think these slides will be going to you. So,
one quick question before we move on to the next speaker is, sometimes students cannot communicate due to their low level of proficiency. So how do you approach that kind of situation?
I think using an interpreter, most schools have language brokers or support staff in the schools. So using those staff and using interpreters in the school system will be very helpful ways to bridge that gap where students will feel comfortable opening up to the educators.
Candace, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, somebody requested the the additional resources, so I'm just popping these back up for you. All right. So in addition to what Fatuma said, I would just say be doing the work now with your institution, with your leadership, to determine what resources you can use to support students with these challenges. There may be community-based services that you can connect with that will help with this, you know, help them or help you be better prepared to support students in these circumstances. So making sure that you are seeking out and reaching out to all of the resources available to you in your community and with your leadership is an essential tool, I would say, to supporting these students.